And welcome back to Law and Crime. We are on verdict watch in Colorado for the trial against Jeremy Cooper and Peter Cichuniec, the pair of paramedics on trial for their role in the 2019 death of Elijah McClain, 23-year-old at the time. He was fatally injured during a police encounter after being placed in a chokehold, then given ketamine. That is really the wild card in this case. He goes into cardiac arrest. He dies later at the hospital. One of the police officers was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide and assault. Two other officers found not guilty. So before the break, we were talking about the testimony of Cichuniec. Now let's move on to the other defendant who also took the stand in this case, Jeremy Cooper. This is his direct examination discussing his justification for giving McClain 500 milligrams of ketamine. Here we go.
So you communicated with your team about what you needed, and what happened next?
So what happened next was I requested 500 of ketamine from the ambulance medic, and then I had my officer go help the EMT get the gurney out of the ambulance to bring up close to Elijah.
Why did you request 500?
So I requested 500. Ketamine is a weight-based drug. You know, there's no real good training of how to estimate weight. So what I've always done in my career is I know how big I am at any given time, and I use my mass compared to what I'm seeing to try to judge, it's an estimate of what I believe the weight to be.
And how did that play out for this situation?
So at that time, I was a little better than 250, almost 260 pounds. And so I thought Elijah to be around 50 pounds lighter than I was, as well as maybe my height, maybe just a little bit taller. So I put him at about that 100 kilos as a rough estimate.
And did that correspond with your training in this area in terms of what to administer for ketamine?
Well, as far as the training of the weight-based, yes, ma'am, that's what I did. And again, how I estimated weight was just how I've been able to do it over my career the best way works for me.
Okay.
I also, speaking of the training, they did have the training on the ketamine that they talked about 300, 400, 500. 300, as we can give this to adults, that's pretty much anybody over 12 or 13 years old. So if you have kind of a adolescent, it's about 300. Small adults is 400, and then like your average adult male is about 500. They said these were safe dosages. And so again, that taught me, okay, then I'm on the right track with 500, as well as the amount of strength that they were describing to me, I thought was indicative of somebody that was average adult male that might have that kind of strength, which again led me to believe that he was probably around that 100 kilo size. So that's why I ordered up the 500 milligram of ketamine.
How fast are you making these decisions in your brain?
Well, from the time we're coming on scene, we're gathering information, we're trying to figure out a game plan. But I guess as a whole picture, it does happen pretty fast within minutes, just depending on whatever decision we're making. It's dependent.
Based on your training, is time of the essence if you're dealing with excited delirium syndrome?
With excited delirium, yes, it is, for all those reasons I kind of listed, the metabolic acidosis, the behavior they're observing. You don't want further injuries, so you want to get that med on board to break that cycle, to kind of disassociate them from what's currently happening, to then safely have them on the gurney and transport to the hospital to get them to a doctor.
Tough not to compare this to the George Floyd scenario, but to hear the EMTs who are defendants in this case, it is interesting and enlightening, and maybe it helps us understand how the jury saw this case. Catherine is here. Jeffrey. So Jeffrey, I'm trying to figure out, hey, did testifying help defendants in this case? Did they hurt defendants? Obviously, every case is fact specific, but there's certainly a core of operative facts that are the same. And you've got one, let me check my notes here. You've got one found guilty. That was Randy Roedema, who did not testify. You have Nathan Woodyard, who did testify, found not guilty. And then you have in a separate trial, Jason Rosenblatt. He was tried with Roedema. He did not testify. He's found not guilty. I got no pattern here. I got nothing that says testifying helped or hurt the defendant. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that testifying is probably a pretty darn good idea for the majority of these defendants because they want to blame someone else for what happened. So they have to explain what was going through their head and why somebody else affected their actions that caused this death. And I think it's hard to not, explain that yourself. That's a hard thing to have someone else explain. The difference for the officer that was acquitted who didn't testify is he had the best lawyer in the state of Colorado. He had Harvey Steinberg. So he had the best counsel imaginable, and he won without testifying. I think everybody else has had some problems with that scenario. But these EMTs are testifying to things that are just not correct. And so the state's putting on experts to say 500 milligrams is too much. That's not how this is administered. This is not the standard of care. And so these guys are a little bit different because we all know that officers get on the stand all the time and say the use of force was required, it was necessary. And people look at it and go, well, who could know if they weren't in that moment? These poor officers with their hard job. But the EMTs, there are standards of medical care that can be used against them. So I think they have more of an uphill battle, which is why they had to testify to explain the situation they were under and why they made the decisions they made that just frankly weren't up to the standard of care and caused the death of Elijah McClain ultimately as the final nail in his unfortunate young coffin.
And Catherine, even this defendant EMT said, I'm not sure about estimating weight. I kind of have my own way about it, which is so critical when administering any drug. I don't know, would you kind of err on the, and it is ERR, look it up, pronounced wouldn't you err on the low side just to make sure you don't OD somebody?
That's what I would do in this situation, or most people that are not that trained, but they're trying to present themselves as trained in this, and for them, they have to err in the upper dosage here. And also, we can hear from their testimony that they said they had to give a higher dose because of what the officers were describing Elijah McClain was doing, that he was exhibiting signs of excited delirium, which is another big issue in itself here. But for both defendants, there is one key word that keeps on popping up, and that is the word training. They keep on saying, this is what I was trained to do. This is what was the training at that time. So we had to administer the ketamine in that manner, and that's why we did it. So they are pointing the blame to the training that they received, which is inaccurate and inappropriate. That's why the policies and procedures here of both the police department and the medics are at issue as well.
Yeah, and it just seems like that whatever they said they relied on from the cops' perspective, they get to see what's happening right in front of them, whether there was this excited condition or not, and that's kind of a made-up thing most experts now suggest. Anyway, let's go back into court now. Cross-examination of the defendant, Mr. Cooper.
So what did you know about what happened before you got there?
That they had made contact with somebody wearing a ski mask, per their words, was not acting appropriately. The officers then had to subdue him, and he was currently resisting the officers.
Okay. So the only information you have is that there's a guy in handcuffs who was not acting appropriately before?
So your question was, when I first got there, when I first talked to the officer, that is what they told me.
Yeah. So you didn't ask why there's all these cop cars around?
Why there's all the cop cars around? I didn't ask about the cop cars, no, sir.
You didn't ask, does the patient have any medical complaints?
I did not ask that, no, sir.
Didn't ask if he had any breathing complaints?
No, sir, I did not ask that.
You never asked if he was rendered unconscious previously?
I did not ask that, no, sir.
You mentioned you wanted to figure out if you spoke English because this is a multicultural community.
Yes, sir.
And so if he didn't speak English, that would be useful information so you could know whether you could ask him questions.
It would definitely change the way that I might be able to ask questions, yes.
Okay. When you found out he did speak English, that meant that you could ask him questions.
It confirmed that he spoke English, yes, sir.
And that meant that you could ask him questions.
I could, yes.
Okay. But you chose not to ask Mr. McClain any questions.
Are you talking about at this specific point?
Well, as long as we're talking about it, the entire time we were there, you chose not to ask Mr. McClain a single question.
I did decide to kind of back off a little bit and not try to escalate things a little bit worse because my first
Sorry, Mr. Cooper.
Oh, I'm sorry.
My question was just, you decided not to ask him any questions the whole time you were there.
Those reasons listed, yes.
Okay. And those reasons listed are you didn't want to escalate the situation?
Yes, sir.
Is it your testimony to the jury that asking Mr. McClain a question like, what's wrong? How can I help you? Would have escalated the situation?
My initial attempt to walk to do so was met with violent restraint. Yes, sir.
Now, this violent restraint that you're talking about, that's the body slam?
Yes, sir.
That was not in response to you attempting to ask Mr. McClain a question, was it?
It was about the time I was walking up to do so, so that's how I took it.
It was about the time in your head you were thinking about asking a question, but it was not in response to you asking a question.
I could be, yes, sir, as I was approaching.
You didn't try to ask Mr. McClain a question before he got body slammed.
Before he got body slammed? No, sir.
Okay, so this is a line of questioning that seems like common sense. If you're on the jury, you're thinking, yeah, why didn't you ask questions of this person you're about to give a jab to of this drug? Jeffrey Wolf is here, Catherine Lizardo. So, Jeff, it seems to me this is a reasonable way to tear down the defense of the defendant, saying, you know, you didn't do all you should have to make a valid determination on whether to administer this ketamine.
Yeah, absolutely. What it's getting to is they want to point to this was not something that we did that was unusual. This is the standard operating procedure, and this was an unfortunate accident, is what they're basically doing with the testimony of talking about their training. And then they're also going to, at the same time, just point the finger at the cops and say that the cops created this environment that made it impossible for them to know what to do and how to basically take care of their patient. Because the EMTs are not cops. They're not there to control the scene. They're there to treat a patient. That's why they're there. And they didn't do that in this case. What you see from the evidence in this case is that the cops basically were beating up a kid when they got there. The cops told them to put him under, and then they gave him 500 milligrams of ketamine. They just did what the cops said, as if they are part of the team. And you see that all too often when you watch body cams throughout our country, where EMTs come in and just take their direction from the cop, and they forget their duty of care to their patient. And instead they become part of the team, and they all sit and they laugh while somebody's in the back of an ambulance together. And it doesn't always end in tragedy, but in this case it did.
Yeah, it's an interesting wrinkle to the George Floyd case, where arguably a jury could find that these guys were the superseding cause of death and that the cops may have done things poorly, but it's the EMTs who killed this kid ultimately. We're going to take a break. Coming back again, we're in verdict watch in the case against Jeremy Cooper and Peter Cichuniec. They are, well, my best guess is at it for about a half an hour today. We will keep an eye on it, of course. When the verdict comes back, we'll have that for you. Stay where you are. Coming right back.
I'm Jesse Weber, and you're watching Law and Crime.